October morning in 1979, with wind pushing dry soil across the lot outside Kellerman Ag Equipment in rural South Dakota, Glenn Coleman pulled in, driving a 1968 Chevrolet C20 that looked like it had already outlived two owners and a junkyard verdict. The truck had 312,000 miles on the odometer, rust through both rocker panels, a cracked bench seat patched with feed sack fabric, and baling twine looped from the driver door frame to the steering column to keep the door shut on gravel roads. Glenn stepped out in a faded canvas coat with one elbow patched in denim, worn overalls, and boots polished only by mud and time. He was 23 years old. Broad-shouldered, quiet, and easy to dismiss, the sales staff did exactly that. One mechanic nodded toward the parts counter and said, low enough to sound polite, that filters were in aisle 2 if he needed to put them on account. Glenn did not answer him. He kept walking toward the finance office where Bryce Kellerman sat behind glass, press shirt, dealership cap still crisp at the edges, keys to a new half-ton pickup laid on the desk beside a chrome pen set. Bryce had already prepared a package for him because he assumed every young farmer wanted the same thing. Scale fast, borrow hard, catch commodity momentum. He slid a typed sheet across the desk and tapped the bottom line with a fingertip. New equipment package. Total financed amount, $186,400 at 11.75% for 7 years. Monthly payment, $3,282. Bryce framed it as an opportunity that would not wait. Rates could rise, inventory could tighten. Serious operators moved now. Glenn scanned the page once, folded it in half, and set it back down. Where are your scrap units parked? Bryce laughed. Not friendly laughter. The kind that assumes the conversation is over because the other person has already lost. He asked Glenn if he understood that old iron was false economy, that cash buyers stayed small, that real farms used credit as leverage. Glenn stood there with his hand on the edge of the desk and said only, I buy what I can pay for. That sentence sounded thin in that office. It sounded poor. It sounded temporary. But that sentence was a hardened rule, built years before he walked through the dealership door. Glenn had grown up on rented ground, 320 acres his father worked under a lease, and a line of operating debt that looked manageable in good years and deadly in bad ones. The mechanism was straightforward and cruel in practice. Variable rate notes, renewing every season, each reset turning uncertainty into math. In 1974, his father carried $94,000 in combined operating and machinery debt at 8.25%. In 1975, rates moved and input costs rose, and the same structure cost him an additional $6,300 in interest over projection. By 1978, after 2 thin harvests and a parts failure during planting, total debt had climbed to $167,000, and the variable terms stepped again. The payment schedule no longer matched the field. It matched the bank calendar. Glenn remembered one evening at their kitchen table, the overhead bulb flickering while his father spread invoices into 3 columns. Seed, fuel, interest. Seed and fuel fed next year. Interest fed nothing. That year, interest was $18,940, nearly equal to what the family spent on food, clothing, school supplies, utilities, and church giving combined over 2 years. His father did not cry at that table. He just stared at the number and said, "This line grows faster than corn." The foreclosure process did not arrive with shouting. It arrived with paperwork, then a posted notice, then an auction date announced in town with the same voice used for livestock sales and volunteer breakfasts. Glenn watched neighbors buy implements his father had rebuilt by hand. Watched his mother carry one box at a time into a borrowed trailer because dignity prefers multiple trips to spectacle. He was 16, and he learned a financial truth most people learn too late. Debt is not dangerous because of bad intentions. Debt is dangerous because weather, prices, and timing do not negotiate. By the second week of November 1979, Glenn had written his own operating rule on a torn feed invoice and folded it into his wallet. Buy only what cash can cover, repair what can be repaired, keep household spending under $9,000 per year, and never give interest first claim on tomorrow's crop. He started with almost nothing besides labor capacity, mechanical patience, and a reputation for finishing what he started. He rented 60 acres at $48 per acre. Total cash rent, $2,880 due in 2 installments. He took seasonal work hauling hay and mending fence, earned $5,740 that winter, and sold 12 feeder calves for $3,360 net after feed. His first-year cash pool was modest and exact. He tracked every dollar in a composition notebook. Opening cash, $9,910. Rent, $2,880. Seed, $2,140. Fuel and oil, $1,280. Fertilizer and chemical, $3,460. Repairs, $640. Household draw, $7,980. Year-end carry, $1,530, plus grain and bin. That repair line, small on paper, became strategy in practice. When Bryce laughed in the office and pointed out the back lot, Glenn walked past 3 stripped combines and 2 tractors with seized engines until he stopped at a Farmall M with no battery, cracked rear tires, and a leaking hydraulic line. Dealer tag said, "Salvage, as is." Price, $900. Glenn paid cash that afternoon. Over the next 6 weeks, he rebuilt it in a machine shed lent by a neighbor after chores. Parts cost $1,460. Carburetor kit, $74. Rear tire pair, $520. Bought used. Hydraulic hoses, $146. Fluids and filters, $93. Ignition components, $118. Seat pan and brackets, $61. Miscellaneous bearings, seals, and hardware, filling the remainder. Labor cost on paper was 0 because he did it himself, but Glenn knew 0 on paper could mean 50 nights and frozen knuckles. He accepted that trade-off. His total investment in a working tractor was $2,360. The comparable financed unit Bryce had pitched carried an effective annual cost above $39,000 once payments, insurance riders, and service contracts were included. That is not a minor difference. That is strategic separation. That patched coat decision would later widen into debt-free land purchases, while other farms were collapsing under variable rates, and it would carry Glenn to a county meeting where even Bryce had to read Glenn's numbers aloud. By spring 1980, the social pressure had sharpened. Glenn's peers were signing larger notes and leasing more acres because lenders were telling them scale would protect margin compression. Bryce drove out to Glenn's place in a clean pickup with dealership plates and one more offer. Expanded line of credit at 13.2%, projected corn at $3.05 per bushel, plus a recommendation to lease an additional 240 acres before rates climbed again. The pitch sounded sophisticated. Spreadsheet logic, growth framing, urgency language. Glenn listened, then handed Bryce a mug of coffee and declined. He had a different move ready, one that looked backward to everyone standing in modern finance logic and forward to anyone who respected solvency. A retiring neighbor named Walter Grinnell wanted to sell 80 rough acres with poor fencing, low organic matter in 2 sections, and no visual appeal for quick-turn operators. Asking price was $14,800 cash. Glenn had $14,800 in savings. He bought it outright. No lien. No annual note renewal. No variable clause waiting in fine print. People called it timid. A few called it foolish because the ground needed work and the tractor looked museum-bound. Glenn started anyway. He planted 140 total acres that season using the rebuilt Farmall and borrowed implement time traded for labor. At his kitchen table, he wrote a full annual plan in pencil with numbers boxed in red. Projected yield 96 bushels per acre, fuel and input budget cap $19,400, household cap $8,760, repair reserve $1,200, and interest expense budgeted at $0. If yield slipped, he would cut draw, delay upgrades, and sell calves. He would not borrow to protect appearances. Bryce marked him in internal notes as undercapitalized and non-growth, which quietly closed the easy credit door many young operators depended on. That designation should have constrained him. In one sense it did. It forced self-financing as his only path. In another sense, it protected him from decisions that looked efficient in strong markets and turned predatory in weak ones. Glenn kept running old equipment, kept writing every expense by hand, kept his life small enough that one bad season did not trigger panic. The patch coat stayed patched. The truck stayed noisy. The balance sheet, almost invisible to everybody else, began stacking the first real bricks. 2 days after Bryce drove away, Glenn took the same 1968 Chevrolet into town for seed pricing, and the truck announced him before he parked because the exhaust had a sharp tick under load and the baling twine on the driver door snapped against the pillar in the wind. The odometer read 312,417. The right fender carried a primer patch the size of a shovel blade. Glenn stepped out in the same faded coat, same overalls, same gloves repaired at the thumb seam with upholstery thread. At Prairie Plains Supply, the spring booking line reached the hallway, and men in clean jackets with dealership ball caps talked loudly about acreage expansion and pre-approved operating lines. At the counter, a clerk named Ronnie Feld looked over Glenn once and slid a yellow form across with the credit section already highlighted. "You can sign this, and we can hold your corn seed," he said. "Payment due after harvest with 12.8% carrying charge from delivery date." Glenn pushed the form back and asked for cash price by variety, treatment level, and bag count. Ronnie paused, then quoted the highest tier first, as if to end the conversation quickly. Glenn took out a folded sheet from his coat pocket, handwritten columns in pencil. Acreage split, target populations, germination thresholds, and hard caps per acre. He bought exactly what he had planned, no more and no less, and paid $2,214 on the spot, counted in 20s and 50s bound by a feed store rubber band. The line went quiet for half a second, then resumed. No one apologized. No one needed to. The assumption had already done its work. By the end of that week, word had moved through 3 town coffee counters that Glenn Coleman was cash poor and machinery broke, because that is how people described a man who refused credit and drove a truck held together with wire and patience. Bryce heard the same story and repeated it in cleaner language at the bank. Non-growth operator, limited upside, monitor exposure. What Bryce did not see was the private architecture underneath Glenn's visible life, built with numbers most people considered too small to matter. Glenn's discipline was not thrift as personality. It was risk management learned young, tested hard, and made specific. After his father's foreclosure, his mother kept a lined notebook in a kitchen drawer labeled utilities and groceries, and every Saturday she wrote each expense down to the cent. January electricity, $41.72. Kerosene, $18.10. Flour and canned goods, $26.43. Church envelope, $5. When Glenn was 17, she handed him that notebook and said, "If a dollar has no job, it leaves." He carried that sentence into every season. In 1977, before he rented his first acreage, he worked 28 weeks at Larson Feed Mill at $4.10 per hour. 48 hours most weeks in harvest months. Gross wages came to $5,510.40. Payroll and withholding took $698.12. Net pay $4,812.28. He lived on $1,936 that year by renting a room above a hardware store for $55 a month and eating what he could cook in one cast iron skillet. He saved $2,876.28 and added $1,120 from repairing 2 neighbor tractors nights and Sundays. Total year-end cash, $3,996.28. In 1978, he increased savings again through a plain strategy that looked boring and compounded anyway. He hauled hay in June and July, welded gates in August, and worked grain trucks through October. Net labor income, $6,340. He bought 12 thin calves at an average of $162 each, total $1,944. Fed them through winter using discounted damage feed sacks. Sold in spring for average $284 each, gross $3,408. After feed, medicine, and sale barn fees, calf margin was $1,192. He ended 1978 with $7,004 cash and 0 personal debt. That was when Walter Grinnell noticed him. Walter was 59, soft-spoken, and known for straight fences and clean books. He did not lend lectures. He lent opportunities. He offered Glenn use of a small machine shed in exchange for 3 evenings a week helping repair boundary fence on his north quarter. No rent, no paperwork, no timeline pressure. One sentence, "Pay me when you can," or help the next one. Walter also gave Glenn his first real template for debt-free scaling. Not ideology, sequence. First, build an operating reserve equal to 1 full season of seed, fertilizer, fuel, and repairs. Second, never let household costs rise with good harvests. Third, buy distressed assets only if repair cost plus purchase price stayed below 35% of replacement value. Fourth, land only with cash, even if it meant waiting. Glenn copied those 4 rules into his ledger and left space under each one for annual totals. By June 1980, he was running days in the field and nights at the table under that same flickering bulb, entering line items with farm store receipts spread by month. Fuel through planting, $3,782. Seed, $2,214. Fertilizer and chemical, $7,946 committed, with deliveries staggered to avoid storage losses. Repairs year to date, $684, including a salvage water pump for $39 and 2 rebuilt hydraulic couplers for $58. Household draw for first half of year, $3,910. with groceries averaging $118 a month and clothing $146 total. He tracked soap and bootlaces with the same seriousness as diesel and nitrogen, because the system only worked if every line obeyed the same rule. Before we go any further, if you want to see exactly how this quiet system later outperformed seven-figure lending models in the same county, subscribe and stay through the full ledger years, because the turning point is arithmetic, not drama. Planting finished late that spring after 2 storms delayed fieldwork, and Glenn kept moving with equipment that would have embarrassed anyone managing for appearances. The Farmall started rough on cool mornings and smoked lightly under heavy pull, but it held oil pressure and did the work. He set maintenance by hour, not mood. Grease every 10 hours, fluid check daily, retorque wheel lugs every 50 hours, and 1 full Saturday each month for preventive fixes. In 1980 alone, he logged 312 tractor hours and spent $1,126 on parts and consumables. A financed, newer unit in the same horsepower class would have cost him $39,384 in first-year payments and coverage riders. His actual cash outflow for motive power, including repairs, was 1/28 of that. He had no illusions about romance in old machinery. Wrenching by flashlight after 14 field hours was not noble. It was simply cheaper than interest. 3 weeks after emergence, Bryce visited again, this time with printed yield projections and a revised credit package framed as protection. He stood by the truck, polished shoes dusty at the edges, and explained that Glenn was leaving money on the table by refusing leverage. He cited neighboring operators moving to 6-row planters, larger combines, expanded leases. He used the same urgency language as before, only tighter now that rates were climbing. Glenn listened, asked one question, and held eye contact. "If corn drops 40 cents, who carries your payment?" Bryce answered with confidence about long-term trend lines and refinancing options. Glenn nodded once and returned to checking a chain tensioner on the planter. The conversation ended there. By August 1980, the first hard evidence of Glenn's approach showed up where few people looked: his cost per planted acre. Including seed, fertilizer, chemical, fuel, repairs, and rent allocation, he was at $138.57 per acre on 140 acres. Total $19,399.80, exactly under his cap. Interest expense remained $0. A comparable debt-loaded operation in his township averaged input and finance costs near $201 per acre that season, according to county extension summaries. And that spread, $62.43 per acre, meant Glenn could survive lower yield years without rolling notes forward. Harvest did not make him rich. It made him durable. Corn averaged 94 bushels per acre across his planted acres, 2 bushels below plain. At $2.78 per bushel cash price, gross corn receipts were $36,591.20. Calf sales added $4,060 net. Miscellaneous custom work brought in $1,370. Total gross farm-related income, $42,021.20. Subtract operating and repair outflow of $19,399.80 and household draw of $8,760, and Glenn closed the year with pre-tax surplus near $13,861.40, plus carry grain in storage. He moved $10,000 of that into a separate envelope account labeled Land Reserve and left the rest as working cash. The man in the patched coat had bought land, funded his season, and ended positive without a single interest payment. In January 1981, he expanded discipline before he expanded acres. He posted a one-page budget on the refrigerator door in his farmhouse, written in thick carpenter pencil. Housing paid, property tax escrow $1,140, food $2,540, utilities $1,020, truck and fuel, personal use $780, medical and insurance $1,110, clothing $210, giving $600, contingency $1,200, total household target $8,600. He circled it and wrote underneath, "Do not reward a good year with permanent cost." The truck remained his public symbol and private filter. At 319,000 miles with rust spreading at the cab corners, it kept sales pitches brief and assumptions predictable. People who saw only decay left him alone. People who watched his books learned something else entirely. Walter Grinnell saw it first and said very little, just once while handing Glenn a box of assorted bolts from his shop shelves. "You are buying time when others buy payments." That sentence proved accurate faster than anyone expected. Rates kept rising. Rain patterns broke. Input bills climbed ahead of grain checks. In coffee shops, men with newer irons started speaking in quieter tones about renewal terms and collateral schedules. Glenn kept recording each dollar, each acre, each repair hour, and each avoided loan as if he were documenting a case study no one had asked for yet. He was. By March 1981, Bryce's internal note still read, undercapitalized and non-growth. Glenn's ledger read something different. Opening cash, $15,392. Operating reserve fully funded. Land reserve $10,000. Total debt $0. The bank never financed him again, but from that point forward, it no longer defined his options. That spring, he made the decision that separated his next decade from everybody else's. He treated 1981 not as a chance to look successful, but as a stress test. He rented only 90 additional acres, all on one-year cash agreements, and refused any term that included automatic rent escalators. Total planted ground moved to 170 acres. He prepaid what he could at discount, delayed what he could without penalty, and left every purchase order clipped to the receipt in date order. The ledger from that year still reads like a mechanic wrote it, and an auditor reviewed it. Corn yield averaged 101 bushels per acre on 170 acres. Total production, 17,170 bushels. Average sale price after storage timing was $2.66. Gross corn revenue, $45,672.20. Calf margin added $8,944 after feed and veterinary costs. Custom baling and 2 weeks of repair labor for neighbors added $3,380. Gross farm income landed at $57,996.20. Operating expense, including rent, seed, fertilizer, fuel, twine, repairs, insurance, and taxes, came to $35,396.20. Net farm income, $22,600. Interest expense, $0. He split that surplus with the same discipline his mother used on grocery money. Land reserve, $12,000. Operating reserve, $6,000. Equipment reserve, $2,400. Household buffer, $2,200. By harvest end, the 1968 Chevrolet had 326,900 miles, more rust around the rear wheel wells, and a new section of fence wire where the twine had worn through. It also had paid tabs, paid insurance, and no payment book in the glove compartment. In 1982, Glenn did not expand acres much, but he expanded margin control. Input suppliers were offering deferred terms at 14% to 15%. He paid cash and negotiated hard discounts that most finance buyers never saw. Seed and chemical booked in December came in 7.5% below spring list. Diesel purchased through a small cooperative contract cut fuel cost by 17 cents per gallon. He also bought a used tandem grain truck for $2,700 cash and put $1,180 into brakes, belts, and tires. Total $3,880 for a truck valued near $11,500 at dealer retail. That year, he grossed $64,410 and held total operating expenses to $36,470, leaving $27,940 net farm income. Again, zero interest. By February 1983, the arithmetic that looked small in 1979 looked decisive. Land reserves sat at $68,740, built from retained earnings and calf sales, not borrowed money. When 120 acres came available from an estate sale at $525 per acre, total $63,000, Glenn arrived with cashier checks and closed in one afternoon. No bank lien, no adjustable clause, no balloon date. The county recorder filed the deed in his name 3 days later. Owned acreage moved from 80 to 200. He kept going in this pattern, and the sequence matters because each year solved the next year's risk before it arrived. 1984. Bought 40 acres adjoining his rough ground at $610 per acre, total $24,400 cash, ended year with $29,300 liquid reserves after all taxes and household draw. 1985. Commodity prices softened, but he held cost per acre at $149.20, cleared $24,880 net, and rebuilt reserve instead of upgrading machinery. 1986. Bought a John Deere 7720 combine at bankruptcy auction for $18,400, while comparable new units listed near $74,000. Added $3,260 in repairs and wear parts. Total all-in cost, $21,660, less than one-third of dealer replacement. 1987. Purchased 90 acres from a retiring couple at $640 per acre, total $57,600 cash, after 2 years of stage savings. 1988. Drought year, low yields, but no forced sales, maintained full ownership and preserved working capital. 1989, acquired 110 acres from distressed collateral release at $700 per acre. Total, $77,000 cash. Total owned land reached 440 acres. Recorded liens, none. That decade-long accumulation looked unremarkable from the road. The farmhouse stayed plain. The coat stayed patched. The truck reached 349,000 miles and still backfired on cold starts. Yet his balance sheet had changed categories. The same lenders who classified him non-growth were now reviewing county records that showed continuous land acquisition with no debt filings attached. Let me stop here and ask you something. When everyone around you says leverage is the only way to grow, would you accept slower growth to keep control, or would you take the larger note and trust good years to cover bad ones? Glenn answered that question with paper, not opinions. The contrast with his peers was not about intelligence or effort. It was about structure. They were hardworking people, experienced operators, and respected neighbors. They made one strategic choice that worked in stable years and broke under volatility. Eli Madsen, who farmed west of Glen by 2 sections, expanded aggressively between 1980 and 1984. He financed land and machinery packages totaling $410,000 on variable terms because fixed rates were already high, and everyone expected rates to normalize quickly. At 11%, his projected annual interest was painful, but manageable. When resets pushed his notes as high as 18.9%, annual interest alone moved above $77,000. His monthly obligations on combined notes reached roughly $6,480 before operating costs. In 2 thin crop years, his gross monthly cash inflow averaged near $5,100. The gap was fatal. He sold equipment first, then livestock, then lost his home quarter at auction. He did not fail from laziness. He failed from compounding math. Ruth and Daniel Pike made a different version of the same bet. They loved dairy work, expanded herd size, and financed milking equipment, feed systems, and tractors with combined equipment notes of $286,000. Their blended payment schedule came to about $4,230 monthly, not counting feed and labor. 2 drought seasons forced expensive purchased feed, milk prices softened, and they ran operating deficits that rolled into short-term credit. By the second year, they were paying interest on feed they had already fed, fuel they had already burned, and repairs already made. They surrendered the dairy and leased out remaining ground to stabilize what they could save. Tomas Herrera invested in center pivot irrigation to protect yields, signing at 14.1% because dry years were already showing up in local forecasts. The system itself worked. The debt stack did not. Corn dropped below his break-even in key months, energy costs rose, and his annual debt service exceeded net operating income even on decent yield. He sold 1 parcel to keep current, then another, then shifted to custom hay work with lower capital requirements. Lyle Benson tried to outrun pressure by restructuring. He rolled short-term notes into longer amortization, then refinanced again when rates stayed high. The total principal never truly shrank because each renewal capitalized fees and unpaid interest. After the 1991 hail losses, he filed Chapter 12 to protect what remained. He later said the year that broke him was not his worst harvest year. It was the year his renewal options disappeared. Through all of it, Glenn did not gloat and did not preach. He shared parts when he had extras. He traded labor for labor. He paid fair cash when he bought from neighbors under strain. His thesis stayed private and practical. If the weather turns against you and the bank is senior to your crop, you are farming for the note, not for your future. By the first week of July 1988, the county entered full drought conditions. Subsoil moisture maps turned from caution colors to emergency colors. Pastures browned early. Dryland corn fired before tassel on weaker ground. Lenders tightened renewals, raised collateral requirements, and shortened patience. Input dealers demanded cleaner paperwork and faster settlements. Monthly payment schedules did not care about rainfall. Glenn's numbers in that period were not pretty, but they were survivable. In 1988, he planted 310 acres across owned and rented ground. Average corn yield fell to 63 bushels per acre. At an average price of $2.42, gross corn receipts were $47,262.60. Calf and custom income added $9,740. Total gross was $57,002.60. Operating expenses were cut to $38,940 through reduced passes, deferred non-critical repairs, and strict fuel control. Net operating margin remained positive. Interest remained $0. He drew just $7,980 for household spending, below his own cap, and entered winter with cash reserves still above $52,000. In 1989, drought stress lingered and rates stayed punishing for debt-heavy farms. Glenn harvested lean again, 68 bushels per acre average on 295 acres. Gross crop income improved slightly on price, but not enough to make anyone comfortable. He responded by doing what leveraged operators could not do in that environment. He waited, paid essentials, and bought only when terms were final and cash priced. That was the year he added the 110 acres and reached 440 owned, debt-free. Bryce remained consistent as the single voice for leveraged expansion. He called debt modernization, argued that old machinery concealed opportunity cost, and presented projections built on trend yield recovery. In ordinary years, those models looked persuasive. In high volatility years, they assumed timing no farmer controlled. At one renewal meeting, he told a room of operators that scale would solve margin compression. Glenn sat in back, said nothing, and left with his hat in hand while two men ahead of him negotiated extensions they would never get. The hardest stretch came from late 1989 through 1990, when drought effects, high carrying costs, and weak pricing converged. In 3 nearby townships, monthly debt service on many operations exceeded monthly gross receipts for consecutive quarters. That is a mechanical breaking point. Once reserves are gone, the next bill chooses for you. Equipment lines were frozen. Emergency restructures multiplied. Auction flyers appeared on mailbox posts almost every week. Glenn absorbed the same weather and the same market. But his structure converted crisis into endurance instead of collapse. He had no lender to satisfy before buying seed. No interest coupon escalating while yields shrank. No covenants forcing asset sales on a timetable. His older, paid-for equipment demanded time and repair money, not financing approval. He lost sleep, lost yield, and lost convenience, but he did not lose control. In 1990, he closed books with modest, positive cash flow again, then did something very Glenn-like with it. He increased his operating reserve to cover a full coming season at stressed prices, and he prepaid property taxes early for a small discount. No celebration, no new pickup, just another quiet layer of protection. By spring 1991, storms replaced drought, and volatility replaced certainty once more. Hail damage that year pushed already strained operations over the edge, and Lyle Benson's filing became final proof that rolling debt forward could postpone judgment, but not cancel it. Glenn's ledgers from that same season show the opposite pattern in plain pencil lines. Lower yield, higher repair hours, no missed obligations, no liens filed, cash still on hand. The bank had not financed him since Bryce's early classification. And by then, the county could see what that had really purchased: patience, ownership, and room to help when others ran out of room. By late summer 1991, while hail claims were still moving through adjusters and renewal officers, Glenn sat with a public accountant named Nora Halverson at a scarred oak desk above the hardware store in town and handed her 15 years of ledgers tied with binder twine. Nora was not sentimental about records. She was exact. She rebuilt his books line by line, assigned depreciation schedules only where they belonged, marked land at purchase cost rather than rumor value, and then ran a second set of numbers that no lender had ever shown him. She modeled what his farm would have paid in interest if he had followed the prevailing structure in the township. The 1979 equipment package at 11.75%, annual operating notes sized to acreage expansion, periodic refinances when rates jumped, and variable resets through the volatile years. She finished the comparison in January 1992. Her total for Glenn's actual interest paid from 1979 through 1991 was still $0. Her modeled total under standard borrowing assumptions was $338,412. She circled that number once and said, "This is why you still have options." Glenn folded the worksheet and put it in his coat pocket without comment. He did not need the argument. He had lived it. But over the next 4 years, as he added more acres and weathered 2 uneven seasons, Nora kept extending the same analysis. By the first week of May 1996, when she closed the 20-year comparison window from 1977 through 1996, the cumulative modeled interest cost reached $612,000 even after conservative assumptions on refinancing terms. She presented the figure as a cash flow fact, not ideology. $612,000 had not been siphoned into interest expense. It had remained on farm and then moved into land, storage, and liquidity. 3 days later, the county's collateral liquidation list came out. A local bank was unwinding distressed assets, and 300 contiguous acres south of Glenn's 440 were listed with a reserve that looked low for the cycle, $690 per acre, total $207,000. The ground was not pretty. Drainage needed attention on the west edge, and one shelter belt line had gone thin. But contiguity mattered more than cosmetics, and Glenn knew exactly what that block would do for field efficiency, trucking lanes, and future lease flexibility. The closing was scheduled for June 14, 1996, in the same bank branch where Bryce Kellerman, now senior agricultural lender, had spent years calling him undercapitalized. Staff from the lending side stood in the back hallway because they had heard Glenn was bidding and assumed he was there to represent another buyer. Bryce came into the conference room with the collateral packet tucked under his arm and the practiced tone of someone still in command of the room. He asked for proof of funds before signatures moved. Glenn slid over 2 cashier checks and 1 personal check. Cashier check 1, $150,000. Cashier check 2, $57,000. Personal check for closing costs, recording and transfer fees, $3,284.17. Bryce looked at the checks, then at Glenn, then called Treasury for verification anyway. The verification came back in less than a minute. Funds good. Immediate settlement authorized. One junior officer in the doorway whispered, not quietly enough, "He paid all of it?" Bryce heard it. So did Glenn. Bryce cleared his throat, signed the release acknowledgement, and moved the papers across. No one laughed this time. Nora's asset worksheet was updated the following Monday. Land holdings were now 740 acres with a combined cost basis of $463,800. Stored grain and livestock inventory, net of obligations, came to $186,240. Cash and short-term equivalents after closing still stood at $224,390. Equipment, valued conservatively, added $118,700. She wrote it plainly. Total net worth, $993,130. Total liabilities, $0. The man in the patched coat had become a near $1-million operator in recorded numbers, and most people in the county still thought he was one breakdown away from quitting. He kept farming the same way. By March 1997, he had made the next non-trivial decision at his own kitchen table with 4 envelopes, 1 yellow legal pad, and Nora's interest worksheet opened to the page with $612,000 circled. He could continue compounding privately and likely do very well, or he could deploy part of that liquidity so younger operators did not repeat the same debt traps that had erased half a generation. He chose a framework built on discipline rather than charity theater. A zero-interest revolving fund seeded with $500,000 from cash reserves and grain sale proceeds. The terms were strict. Borrowers had to submit monthly bookkeeping sheets, attend a 12-session financial class, led by extension educator Mary Klein, and sign a covenant barring new luxury equipment purchases while any fund balance remained. Money could be used for seed, fuel, rent, repairs, modest used machinery, and targeted infrastructure. It could not be used for vanity upgrades. Repayment language stayed in Glenn's plain style. Pay me when harvest pays you, but show your books every month. The first 5 allocations were made by October 1997. Loan 1 went to Aaron Bloom, age 26, who had 120 leased acres and no family land cushion. Amount $68,000 at 0% over 6 years, with quarterly reporting. He used $41,200 for operating inputs, $18,300 to repair a used planter and grain truck, and held $8,500 as weather buffer. He repaid in 5 years and 2 months, then took no further loans. Loan 2 went to Marisol Keene, age 31, managing 95 acres of mixed hay and corn after a divorce settlement left her with equipment but little working capital. Amount $54,000 at 0% over 5 years. She spent $22,400 on irrigation line repairs, $19,100 on inputs, and $12,500 on leased pasture access. By 2002, she had turned positive 3 seasons in a row and began prepaying installments. Loan 3 went to Ruth and Daniel Pike as a restart package, $72,500, structured over 7 years with annual principal targets tied to milk and feed margins. They did not rebuild the old high-debt dairy model. They shifted to a smaller, lower overhead operation and a 160-acre lease arrangement with fixed cash terms. Their monthly stress dropped from more than $4,000 in prior note obligations to under $1,300 in combined lease and operating commitments during the first cycle. Loan 4 went to Tomas Herrera, $61,000, to transition from debt-heavy irrigation corn into custom hay and forage services with lower capital intensity. He bought a dependable used swather, rebuilt a boiler, prepaid seasonal fuel, and leased storage space rather than building new. His break-even revenue requirement fell by more than 40% in the first full year. Loan 5 went to Eli Madsen, not for a dramatic comeback, but for dignified stability. $44,000 over 6 years to secure a 40-acre parcel lease option, purchase essential used equipment, and establish a structured savings escrow that he could not raid in lean months. Eli's first repayment check was $600. Glenn deposited it without ceremony and mailed back a 1-line receipt. The fund did not remove hardship. It changed timing and control. Borrowers still faced weather, commodity swings, and repair surprises. What they no longer faced was compounding interest, taking first claim on every setback. By the second harvest cycle, the effects were measurable. The 5 original borrowers together cultivated 575 acres directly and supported work across another 210 acres through custom services. Their combined gross receipts in 1999 reached $1,042,300. Combined debt service to commercial lenders, excluding land leases, was under $39,000 because most operating capital came through the revolving pool at 0%. A benchmark group of similarly sized operations in adjacent townships carried average annual interest and finance charges closer to $116,000 at the time. The spread, roughly $77,000 in 1 year, stayed local as repairs, wages, and retained reserves instead of leaving the county as finance cost. Nora tracked the fund with the same rigor she used on Glenn's farm books. Default policy was clear. 2 missed reporting months paused new disbursements. 4 missed months triggered supervised restructuring with no penalty interest but mandatory expense cuts. Between 1997 and 2003, total principal disbursed reached $1,184,000 because repaid dollars recycled. Principal repaid by then was $734,000. Outstanding active balances were $450,000, exactly equal to the fund's initial seed, which meant the original capital remained intact while serving multiple cohorts. The deeper arithmetic made Bryce's old model look increasingly fragile under volatility. Nora ran a comparative sequence for county meetings using matched acre bands and conservative assumptions. 1992, Glen net farm income, $31,480, interest $0, reserve addition $18,000. 1993, net $36,920, interest $0, land reserve $96,400. 1994, net $42,110, interest $0, storage expansion paid cash $48,600. 1995, net $39,700, interest $0, liquid reserves $312,200 year-end. 1996, bought 300 acres for $207,000 cash, interest $0. 1997, seeded revolving fund with $500,000. Retained farm liquidity after contribution, $141,300. 1998, farm net $47,260, despite lower price cycle. Fund repayments received $88,400. 1999, farm net $53,840. Fund disbursements $146,000 to second cohort. 2000, farm net $49,120. Emergency weather deferments granted to 2 borrowers, no defaults. 2001, farm net $57,330. Fund principal outstanding $462,700 across 9 operators. 2002, farm net $61,040. Cumulative interest paid by Glen since start of records remained $0. 2003, combined recipient acreage crossed 1,900. Total scheduled repayments current at 96.8%. Then she placed a parallel estimate beside it. If Glen had accepted the original 1979 equipment financing and followed typical expansion borrowing, cumulative interest by 2003 would likely have exceeded $820,000, even with favorable refinance windows. Instead, those dollars had either remained in his reserves or been redeployed into land and the revolving pool. That was the core tension resolved in numbers. Conventional leverage promised speed, but consumed resilience. Cash discipline looked slow, but created optionality. And optionality let one farm become a stabilizing institution for others when cycles turned harsh. By the first week of September 2004, Glen's old Chevrolet rolled past 380,000 miles with new rust at the bed seams and the same feed store wire solution on the door after the latch failed again. He still wore the patched coat in cold weather. He still bought used where used made sense. Yet the ledgers now showed two interlocked engines of strength, his own debt-free operation, and a revolving structure that had already carried multiple families through years when commercial credit tightened. The county had started to notice, even those who once dismissed him, and in lender offices, where growth had always been defined by loan volume, a quieter definition was beginning to compete. How many bad seasons a farm could survive without surrendering its future? By the second week of October 2004, that competing definition was no longer theoretical. Two applicants sat across from Mary Klein at the extension office with strong yield history and clean character references, and both had been declined by commercial lenders after a collateral policy revision tightened loan-to-value thresholds on older equipment. Glenn approved both through the revolving fund within 9 days, $38,000 to Caleb Noren for operating inputs and grain dryer repairs, and $29,500 to Denise Weller for rent, seed, and a used no-till drill. He asked the same question he always asked: show the books monthly, keep household costs flat, buy no vanity iron. By February 2005, the fund had 13 active operators and 1 waiting list, and Nora Halverson moved from hand-entered ledgers to a simple database, so repayment schedules and crop year variance could be tracked across cohorts. She also imposed 1 new metric: stress coverage ratio, defined as liquid reserve divided by next season essentials. Glenn required a minimum of 0.65 before any borrower could add acres. It sounded rigid. It prevented panic borrowing later. The first cohort matured exactly the way Glenn had hoped, and almost no one else had predicted. Aaron Bloom completed his original $68,000 repayment in 2002, then spent 3 years building cash and bought 80 acres in 2005 at $1,180 per acre, total $94,400, paid by cashier check and calf sale reserves. He now ran 260 acres, then 340, and by 2014 he had no operating debt and a reserve covering 1.2 full seasons. Marisol Keene finished her 5-year schedule early, opened a second hay contract route, and by 2009 she held long-term leases on 210 acres with a paid-for pivot rehabilitation that she had funded from retained earnings, not notes. Ruth and Daniel Pike rebuilt slower than either of them had once imagined, but they rebuilt on solid footing. Their smaller dairy model stabilized by 2006, and a fixed 160-acre lease through Glenn's structure gave them predictable costs during volatile feed years. Tomas Herrera's custom hay business crossed $300,000 gross in 2011 with low fixed overhead, and he repaid every revolving fund dollar on schedule. Eli Masson did not chase scale again. He chose stability, rebuilt habits first, then assets, and that choice saved him. If you are learning something from this, like and share it with someone who still believes borrowing's the only route to growth, because this section of the story is where arithmetic overrules ego. 3 days into September 2006, Walter Grinnell died at 66 after a short illness, and his funeral filled the small church beyond fire code seating. Glenn stood in back, hat in hand, and spoke only once at the graveside. He taught sequence. That fall, Glenn gave Walter's daughter, Elaine Grinnell, a certified check for $87,500, equal to the inflation-adjusted value of the shed access, labor opportunities, and early help Walter had provided when Glenn had almost no margin for error. Elaine used part of it to clear medical balances and placed the rest into a trust for her two sons' agricultural education. Glenn asked for no recognition and declined having his name on anything. By late spring 2008, the county faced its hardest liquidity squeeze since the high-rate years. Fertilizer invoices had doubled from prior contracts, diesel costs surged, and operating notes were being cut or repriced in ways that pushed monthly obligations above realistic cash flow tolerance. In 1 week, Glenn deployed capital faster than any local lender because no committee approval stood between decision and action. He issued $220,000 in 0% bridge loans to 5 young operators who had approved plans but frozen credit lines. He used $140,000 to buy back foreclosed equipment units and leased them at maintenance cost only, no profit margin. He committed $310,000 to a cooperative seed and fuel pool that locked bulk pricing and reduced per-acre input cost for participating farms by an average of $24.70. Total emergency deployment, $670,000 in 7 days. At the county meeting that June, Bryce Kellerman made one final leveraged expansion case tied to high commodity forecasts and capturing scale while confidence is available. Glenn waited until Bryce finished, then asked Nora to distribute a one-page comparison of 10-year local outcomes by structure. Glenn's line was simple and complete. Cumulative interest paid, $0. Matched leveraged operations in comparable acreage bands. Between $480,000 and $1.2 million in cumulative interest and finance charges over the same period. No raised voice, no speech-making, just numbers, dates, signatures, and recorded filings. Borrowers in Glenn's network survived that cycle with fewer forced liquidations than surrounding counties. Caleb Noren kept his lease and later purchased 60 acres in 2012. Denise Weller expanded from 140 to 230 acres and ended 2016 with positive retained earnings for the 6th consecutive season. 2 operators needed deferments and 1 needed a supervised budget reset, but none were forced into foreclosure under Glenn's terms. That was the difference between pressure and collapse. Bryce's resolution came quietly, which fit the truth better than drama. By harvest 2009, he had begun revising his recommendations, first in private meetings, then in lender workshops, advising younger operators to stress test payment schedules at lower commodity prices and higher rates before signing. He did not become a convert overnight, and he did not publicly recant his whole career. But he changed. In 2010, he retired, 2 seasons after that county meeting, and at a regional lender panel, he gave the line people repeated for years because it sounded like an admission and an epitaph at the same time. He did not need my money. He needed patience. Bryce moved to Sioux Falls, consulted part-time on risk controls, and by all accounts treated younger loan officers with more caution than he had shown when he was certain leverage solved everything. By the first week of April 2012, Glenn and Nora formalized the revolving operation into Coleman Field Fund with audited annual statements and a board of 3, Nora, Mary Klein, and Aaron Bloom as recipient representative. Glenn remained final signatory but delegated routine review. The fund did not drift from its original rules. Monthly books, no luxury equipment while balances remained. Household discipline documented. No exceptions for personality. Roll call mattered to Glenn because unresolved stories turn into mythology, and mythology hides costs. Eli Madsen accepted Glenn's offer to manage the central grain storage site in 2013 at a steady salary with performance bonuses tied to shrink control and maintenance timing. By 2024, his personal savings had rebuilt to $146,000, and he carried no consumer debt. Ruth and Daniel Pike kept the 160-acre lease and gradually transferred operating control to their daughter, Claire Pike, who bought a small milking parlor with retained earnings and no note. It was fully paid by 2021. Tomas Herrera remained in custom hay and forage logistics, current on every zero-interest repayment, and trained 2 apprentices who later opened their own service routes. Lyle Benson, after Chapter 12 restructuring and negotiated settlements, became a mechanic in town, purchased a modest home in 2018 with a conservative fixed mortgage. He retired early and says one wrong loan season cost him a decade. Aaron Bloom now farms 520 acres, debt-free except for short seasonal payables that he clears within cycle. Marisol Keene operates 340 acres and a contracted forage business, still submitting cleaner monthly books than most full-scale operations. Caleb Noren runs 210 acres and serves on the local cooperative board. Denise Weller and her brother now manage 300 acres with no equipment notes. Mary Klein retired from Extension in 2019 and continues teaching bookkeeping workshops twice each winter through the fund. Nora Halverson retired from full-time accounting in 2020, trained 2 successors, and still reviews annual audit letters. Ronnie Feld, the clerk who once pushed a highlighted credit form across the counter, bought Prairie Plains Supply in 2017 with partners and shifted policy to post both cash and finance pricing transparently. Younger operators say that one change saved them from signing terms they did not fully understand. Elaine Grinnell remains on the family place and sends a handwritten note to Glenn each Christmas. Glenn's mother died in 2008, debt-free, in the same county where she once wrote grocery totals to the cent. His father died years earlier, and Glenn paid for the marker upgrade without telling anyone except the stonecutter. By harvest 2024, Glenn's operation had transitioned to a 2-person management team he trained for 8 years, Aaron Bloom and Claire Pike, with written authority thresholds and a standing rule that no debt instrument could be signed without unanimous board consent, and 2 stress scenarios on paper. Glenn still reviewed monthly ledgers at his kitchen table. The 1968 Chevrolet remained registered, now at 400 to 1,000 miles, rust deep at the bed seams, doors still needing a pull and lift motion to latch. The Farmall M he bought for $900 sat under cover, still operational, used for light auger duty and parade day, total restoration spend over 4 decades. $9,840, including all parts and paint, still less than 1 year of payments on many modern finance packages from the era he refused. The numbers closed the argument cleanly. Net worth documented in 2024, $8.6 million across land, grain inventory, and cash equivalents with 0 debt instruments. Revolving fund recipients to date, 32 operators managing 6,740 acres with combined estimated equity of $24.3 million. Of those, 11 started parallel local funds, totaling $1.9 million, each copying Glenn's core terms with local adjustments. One disciplined farm had become a county-level stabilizer. If you want more stories where ordinary people use plain arithmetic to build uncommon freedom, subscribe now. In the comments, answer this specific question. What single expense line in your own life would you cap first if you wanted to buy back control? Share this story with the person who looks 1 season away from quitting because they may need a different framework, not a bigger loan. Glenn closed the 2024 ledger on a cold November evening, set the pencil down, and walked past the old truck toward the machine shed, where the Farmall waited under a canvas cover. The county road was quiet, the yard light warm on rusted steel and clean concrete. He had been judged poor in every way that could be seen from a parking lot. He had built wealth in every way that survives a bad year. The bank never financed him again, and because of that, families stayed on their land, fields stayed independent, and a philosophy written on a torn feed invoice outlived the men who laughed at it. The morning after Glenn walked past the truck and into the shed, he carried 2 boxes into the Coleman Field Fund office above the cooperative scale house, 1 box with original ledgers and 1 with supporting papers, auction receipts, cashier check stubs, tax statements, and the Nora Halverson worksheets with the $612,000 figure still circled in blue ink. Aaron Bloom unlocked the file room, Claire Pike cleared shelf space, and Nora's successor, Denise Weller's younger brother Martin, logged every document into the audit index before noon. Nothing stayed anecdotal. Every physical record was scanned, stamped, and stored in fireproof cabinets, with originals sealed in labeled archive cartons. The torn feed invoice rule Glenn had kept in his wallet since 1979 was placed in a clear sleeve and attached to the policy binder. Under it, Aaron typed 1 line for future board members. Founding operating rule, active by board vote. By the 3rd week of November 2024, the fund's annual borrower review filled the extension hall, not with speeches, but with spreadsheets, receipts, and plain talk. Mary Klein, retired but still sharp, called names and read outcomes. Caleb Noren stood first, boots still dusty, and handed over his year-end statement. Gross receipts, $412,600, operating expense $301,900, family draw $49,200, reserve contribution $21,500, debt service to fund $0, commercial interest paid $0. Claire checked his stress coverage ratio at 0.92 and nodded. You can add 40 acres if rent stays fixed, she said. Caleb answered with 3 words Glenn liked. Only if cash. Denise Weller followed with her own books and a quiet half-smile. She and Martin had finished upgrading their no-till drill with used components and labor done in-house, total $8,640 instead of the $42,000 package a dealer offered. Her 2024 net, after all costs, was $86,300, and she moved $30,000 into reserve before discussing any expansion. Across the room, Tomas Herrera presented custom hay contracts for the next season, all prepaid deposits, no financed fuel. Ruth and Daniel Pike submitted Claire's milking parlor maintenance plan and proof the parlor remained paid in full. Eli Madsen, now storage manager with steady hands and steadier books, reported shrink at 0.7%, the best mark in 7 years, and added that his personal savings account crossed $146,000 exactly, the number he had written as a target on a yellow card and kept in his desk drawer. These were not dramatic victories. They were durable ones. The numbers were equally clear at scale. 32 recipient operations now managed 6,740 acres. Combined estimated equity, based on conservative county land values and inventory at cost, stood at $24.3 million. 11 former recipients had launched local zero-interest pools totaling $1.9 million, each with the same non-negotiable structure: monthly books, spending caps, no vanity machinery. The multiplier was no longer a theory model on Nora's worksheet. It was visible in deeds, reserve balances, and families still on their ground. 3 days later, on a gray Tuesday with sleet Tapping the windows of the county community room, a lender training session opened with archive footage and transcript pages from Bryce Kellerman's 2009 to 2010 guidance seminars, the last cycle before his 2010 retirement. In the recording, Bryce asked that Glenn be acknowledged in the front row. He was older, slower, no longer dressed like he had somewhere to sell right after lunch. He did not attempt revisionist history. He began with the 1979 package amount, $186,400 at 11.75%, and read his own old assumptions aloud. Scale first, service debt through growth, refinance when needed. Then he placed Glenn's 20-year interest total on the screen, $0, and beside it the matched range from comparable leveraged operators, $480,000 to $1.2 million. He spoke for less than 10 minutes. I believed leverage was modernization, he said. In stable years it can be. Under volatility it can be a trap if reserves are weak. I did not see that clearly enough when he was 23. In the seminar transcript from that period, he walked to Glenn afterward, handed over a thin folder, and said, "These are my archived notes on your early credit file. Undercapitalized. Non-growth. You may want them for the record." Glenn accepted the folder, glanced once at the first page, and passed it to Claire. "Put it in archive," he said. Bryce gave one short laugh, not bitter this time. "Fair." He retired in 2010 and, according to younger officers he mentored, spent his last working stretch teaching one rule he once ignored: stress test every loan at bad weather and bad price, not best case yield, and repeating the line that stayed with them. He did not need my money, he needed patience. By the first week of December, Glenn hosted the winter roll call supper in his machine shed, heaters humming, folding tables lined with chili kettles and pie tins, the Farmall M parked clean along the wall with fresh oil and a rebuilt magneto installed by Lyle Benson. Lyle had become the mechanic everyone trusted for honest diagnostics. He arrived early, wiped his hands, and told Aaron the old Farmall would run another decade at auger duty if they kept to the maintenance chart taped above the bench. Ronnie Feld came with invoices from Prairie Plains showing transparent dual pricing, cash and financed, just as he had promised years earlier when he changed store policy. Elaine Grinnell brought 2 framed photos of Walter, one from his fence line and one from the church picnic, and placed them beside the coffee urn. Nora Halverson, thinner and slower but still exact, reviewed the final annual audit letter at a side table. Clean opinion, no unresolved disbursements. Reporting compliance above 96% across active borrowers. She signed the cover page and handed it to Mary Klein, who initialed the training completion roster for the winter bookkeeping classes she still taught twice each season. Aaron and Claire then signed the 2025 operating authority sheet under the rule Glenn had written decades earlier, and now insisted they own together. No debt instrument without unanimous board consent, and 2 adverse scenarios on paper. Every named life had a place in that room or a clearly marked memory. Glenn's mother and father were mentioned in grace, both gone, both buried debt-free in county ground. Walter was gone, his influence active in every fund covenant. Bryce was alive in Sioux Falls, retired. His final professional stance changed. Eli had stability. Ruth and Daniel had continuity through Claire. Tomas had a business with margin and apprentices now independent. Lyle had a paid-off home and no open balances. Aaron had moved from first borrower to co-manager. Marisol, delayed by weather, called in during dessert and read her year-end line over speakerphone, Reserve ratio 1.1, zero interest, expansion deferred 1 year by choice. Caleb and Denise had both crossed the threshold, from surviving to sponsoring others. Near 9 that night, after the last truck lights left the yard, Glenn and Claire settled the final loose threads at the kitchen table. The one-page county comparison from the 2008 meeting was removed from a desk drawer, copied, and filed with board minutes so it would not disappear when memories did. The old lender folder Bryce had handed over was indexed and archived with notation, historical classification only, no active relevance. The strange details people once used to judge him, rusted truck, patched coat, twine and wire on a stubborn door, were no longer rumors to correct or symbols to defend. They were documented context in a complete record. By New Year's week, the 1968 Chevrolet turned 401,344 miles and still started on the second try in cold weather. The baling twine was gone, replaced years earlier by a welded latch bracket, but a short length of fence wire still hung from a hook in the cab as a private reminder of what he began with. The Farmall started clean, idled steady, and turned the auger through one more load of corn. Aaron logged hours. Claire logged moisture. Glenn closed the notebook. The farmer who looked poorest was richest. The lender who laughed ended by teaching caution. The neighbors who fell under debt were not forgotten. They were folded back into work with dignity and structure. Cash discipline did not make Glenn famous. It made him useful. One refusal in 1979, one junkyard tractor, one rule written on torn paper, and 45 years of unglamorous arithmetic kept land independent that would otherwise have been auctioned away. The bank never financed him again. That was the point. That was the freedom. That was the legacy that stayed when the weather turned and the market did what markets always do.